Hi, this is Outdoors writer David Figura for nyup.com and syracuse.com. And today I'm with two deer experts from the New York State DEC. Jeremy Hurst, who's the big game unit leader for the DEC. Jeremy, raise your hand there.
Hey, everyone.
And Mike Wasilco, who's Region 8 Wildlife Manager.
Hello.
What we're going to talk about today is deer and where the most deer in the state are being taken each year. And that is summed up every year by the DEC in its annual deer harvest summary estimate, which is online on the DEC website. And Jeremy, I'll start off with you. Where do those numbers come from?
So those numbers come from a couple different places. Our numbers that we generate for the hunting season come predominantly from hunters themselves. When they report their harvested deer, they let us know where and when they took it. We then use that information together with the staff that we have in the field checking deer each fall. And so our staff check deer at freezer lockers and a few roadside check stations. We check about 15,000 deer a year. And with that, we can determine what portion of the deer that we check were actually reported also by hunters. And that is used to develop what we refer to as the reporting rate. Generally, about 50% of hunters report their deer, even though it's required by law. We get about 50% of the hunters that are complying with that and reporting their deer, and we can use that to generate a harvest estimate. Now, the reporting rates are calculated specifically to each tag type and different regions of the state, and so it allows us to get a regional variation both on the reporting rate and also then to estimate our harvest regionally as well.
Okay.
We generate the harvest by town and county and wildlife management unit, as well as the sex and age of those deer that are taken.
One of the things that impressed me when I was looking through that report recently is that Steuben County, and if you look at the number of bucks taken and the number of total deer taken, leads the state. And evidently that's been a trend almost every year. I mean, there was 7,508 bucks taken last year, 13,240 deer total. Just blew everyone else away. Mike, what's going on there in Steuben County?
Well, I mean, the biggest factor in the total numbers taken is just that Steuben County is a big county. It's a little over 1,400 square miles. So it's one of the probably top 6 in area for the state. So just by default, it's going to have higher numbers of deer, even if they're the same density as a smaller county. But on top of that, it also has a good mix of really good deer habitat, a good mix of forested habitats and agricultural lands, as well as a lot of opportunity for hunters in public lands access, as well as a lot of private lands that are huntable.
One of the things that also stood out is the DEC, looks at things in terms of wildlife management units. And when it comes to the take density of a wildlife management unit, you've got wildlife management unit 8R, where 14.5 deer were taken per square mile last year. That's a lot of deer. Once again, what's going on there?
Again, that's a unit that is really good deer habitat. It has a great mix of agricultural and forest land, so good deer cover. It doesn't get severe winters, so you don't have winter kill issues, except in the extremely severe winters. And it's got good hunter access. There's public land, there's lots of private lands, lots of people that deer hunt. And so year after year, it leads the state in number of deer taken.
Getting back to that issue of access, can you give me a breakdown of that county or that area as far as public versus private land, and how does it compare with other parts of the state?
I would say Steuben County has a good mix of public lands. They're kind of spread out throughout the county. They're not all lumped in one spot. And they're kind of adjacent to decent deer habitat. It actually has less public land than adjacent Allegheny County, but the public lands are probably a little bit more accessible, better road access, allowing the public to utilize them a little bit better.
You use the term decent deer habitat. Elaborate a little bit on that.
Deer need to have habitat that provides them food and shelter. So you may have, the big woods areas where there's no cropland around. There's lots of shelter. There's not a lot of food. But when you have forested ridges and farmlands on the top of the ridge and then down in the valley bottoms, the deer don't have to travel far to get to good, nutritious food throughout the year.
How big of a deal is the quality, the QDMA, quality deer management, effort over there? Do you have a lot of people involved in that?
I don't know necessarily how many, but it's a fairly active area for quality deer management. There's probably also a lot of people that are managing for deer that aren't officially part of the QDMA program.
And I was just wondering, now Steuben is always up there. It seems like looking at that deer summary, there's some other areas of the state that also are almost every year up there as far as number of deer taken and the amount of deer taken per square mile. Jeremy, what are the other hot spots, like 4 of the other hot spots in the state?
Well, again, it depends partly on how you look at the numbers. So if you're just looking at the total deer that are taken or the total number of bucks that are taken, that's really going to be reflective of 2 pieces of information. One, the number of deer that are there and the size of the landscape. And so some of our highest total deer take counties or management units are the largest ones. Just makes more sense. There's covering more ground and more deer being killed. So for our purposes and for management purposes, we almost always just use the harvest density as a metric. It's more relevant to compare across spaces. And so from a harvest density standpoint, nearly always the highest density harvests, both of buck harvest and of doe harvest, are coming from the Finger Lakes and Western Finger Lakes area. And so that portion in Livingston and Yates and Wyoming, Genesee sometimes is a little more like Lake Plains, but Steuben and Allegheny counties as well. The wildlife management units that are in that part of the state produce the highest density deer harvests year in, year out. Now, we also have really good deer harvests in some of our suburban areas, such as Westchester County and Suffolk County. The harvest densities aren't as great because they are much more heavily developed. But on the huntable landscape out there, the deer harvest can be quite substantial.
And once again, characteristics of those areas that make them such good deer hunting areas?
Well, focus on the Finger Lakes area. Those areas, just like Mike described, it's just such an ideal mix of good habitat with good agricultural mix with forested landscape that provides great ample food and good shelter for deer. And deer grow well and reproduce well, and the deer populations do quite well there. And of course, then with more deer on the landscape at a greater frequency, hunters are going to encounter them and harvest more deer per square mile.
Are the deer bigger out there?
So if you look at deer metrics, like a weight per age, deer are going to be bigger where they have more food. If we look at antler characteristics as a metric to look at comparative health of deer in western part of the state, in the Finger Lakes and in the Lake Plains, and again in some of our suburban areas, tend to produce larger antlers by their first year, larger antlers on their second year compared to deer elsewhere. They just have access to better nutrition and are able to put on more body mass and more antler mass in the same amount of time.
Wow. Is there anything I'm leaving out here, guys, as far as, why these places are the top deer hunting areas of upstate New York?
Well, we didn't really cover doe harvest, right? And so
Okay.
One of the reasons why some of those counties and management units have really high deer harvest is because we make a lot of doe tags available for hunters to kill deer. And so when we're just looking at comparative deer population size, monitoring just the buck harvest density is a good tool. But in portions of Yates County, WMU, 8N, 8R, we have substantial amounts of doe harvest or doe tags available for hunters to harvest deer. And that then drives up why the total take is 14.5 deer per square mile. And so because those populations are so robust, because deer breed well, produce 2 offspring per bred doe generally, they the populations can grow quickly, and we need to make sure that we're harvesting enough deer in order to not allow those populations to grow out of control. Mike, maybe you have some more detail you want to offer.
Yeah, I mean, going along with that, historically, those units in those areas, Steuben County, Livingston County, or the southern tier, those units have tended to be managed for higher deer populations than, say, the Lake Plains. So the habitat in the Lake Plains can probably support as higher numbers of deer, but there's a higher density of agricultural land and not as much tolerance for crop damage because there's not as much other habitat for those deer to be in, so they're in the crop fields. So those Lake Plains units are managed for a lower deer density than, say, the southern Steuben County areas where there's a lot more forest habitat for those deer to spend their time in other than crop fields. So historically, they were managed for higher density, so they're producing more deer. And the other big factor is that compared to, say, the northern zone, the Adirondacks, where you have really big units, lots of deer habitat, maybe a little bit lower quality deer habitat, is the winter severity in the southern tier is, and especially once you get away from the lake effect zones off of Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, you don't have the deep winter snows that can really impact deer, making it hard for the young to make it through their first winter, make them more vulnerable to predation by dogs or coyotes. And so they don't have as much of an impact from winter, so they can go into the next breeding season in much better shape, produce more fawns, take advantage of the great feed that's available, and produce bigger bodies.
One thing I wonder about, though, in looking at these numbers, you're talking about these, I would assume, big stretches of agricultural land, which would supply a lot of food for the deer. How much of these numbers are we looking at are from hunters, and how much are from nuisance permits of farmers, trying to wipe out as many deer of their properties as possible because they're having crop damage?
It's a good question, Dave. In our annual harvest summary, we only report harvests that are taken by legal hunters. And so it's only hunting season harvest by our typical hunting tags, including the Deer Management Assistance Program, since that's utilizing hunters. All the harvest that takes place outside of the hunting season on nuisance deer kill tags that we issue to farmers and others to take deer in site-specific situations outside of the hunting season, that's not tallied in these reports. However, there is one table in our annual deer harvest summary where I show what that information is, so hunters can see what the relative contribution between nuisance tags and hunting seasons harvest are. And really, the nuisance harvest across the state is a drop in the bucket compared to what hunters take. We're talking maybe 10,000 deer taken on nuisance tags a year, whereas hunters obviously take 220,000, 230,000 deer.
Wow. How many deer were taken last year total?
224 and change, I believe, 224,000, something like that.
How does that compare with years past?
So we're holding pretty steady. It's certainly not our high, which we had back around 2001, 2002. But I would say we'd like hunters to take more. We've got a bunch of places in the state where we need to kill more deer. Last year's harvest was a little bit lower than we were hoping for, particularly the antlerless harvest. And so we increased the number of tags again this year to try to get hunters to give them opportunity to take a few more antlerless deer. So I'd like to see that harvest climb a little bit this year.
Now, you also have, it would seem, an increased number of hunters out there because of if the number of people who've taken and passed the hunter safety course online is any indication, you're going to have a bump in the number of hunters out there. In these prime great areas, have you issued more nuisance permits this year? Like Steuben, is there more doe tags issued this year than years past, or are things still kind of the same?
So this year, you're right that we have had a lot of people take the hunter safety course, and that's been great since we've offered it online. Right now, it looks like our license sales is up about 15% for hunting licenses than in last year. And so that's a good thing too. And we issued most of our deer management permits in many areas. We still have leftover tags in some areas, but the leftover tags are actually in the areas where we typically have them, which is in the Finger Lakes and the Lake Plains, where we want to kill a lot of deer. And so there are still opportunities for hunters to get leftover doe tags in those units. We have some areas where we would like to issue 30 tags per square mile in order to achieve the 7 deer harvested per square mile that we need to. And so there's still ample time for hunters to get those doe tags in some of those western and units in regions 7, 8, and 9.
So in Steuben County, I could still get a deer management permit?
You know, I don't know offhand on that one, but the information is available on our website.
Yeah, I would say no. None of the units in Steuben County tend to be the ones that have leftover doe tags. And speaking of, you mentioned kind of before nuisance permits, the nuisance tags. I would say in Steuben County and most of Region 8 at least, the number of nuisance deer complaints we had this year is about on par for previous years. It wasn't up a lot. And those are separate from the deer management permits, the doe tags during the hunting season.
Okay, all right. Well,
yeah,
gentlemen,
and I just looked. We took hunters, not hunters, on those nuisance tags. Agriculturalists and others that get those tags. Harvest was about 5,200 deer last year, compared to the 224,000 deer that hunters took. So substantially difference in scope. Even though we hear a lot about it, and there's always complaints from hunters about the farmer who shoots a couple deer, clearly the impact is local, as it's intended to be, on that farm, and not broad scale to affect the deer population generally.
gentlemen, thank you very much. And the Southern Zone opener is this Saturday, and stay tuned.